Hello, thank you for listening to our talk. It's entitled Situating Youth Refugees Linguistic and Literacy Development in Glocal Perspective. And I'm joined today with doctoral candidates Kate Patterson and Yasmin Hakouz, and we're all from the University of Western Ontario. So to start off with, if you look on the right-hand side, it shows the top 10 origin countries of people that were displaced across borders as of mid-2020. And so the country with the highest amount of refugees is Syria with over 6 million, followed by Venezuela with over 3 million, and then South Sudan and Afghanistan with over 2 million each. And in the Canadian context, you all heard about in 2015, 2016, when Canada resettled over 40,000 Syrian refugees. And they were referred to as prima facie refugees in that they didn't have to prove their refugee status. They didn't have to go through the refugee hearings or anything. They just automatically became permanent residents. However, youth refugee students were not tracked. And so they don't show up any differently on any sort of formal records than immigrant students. So moving on to the next slide, there's an infographic that shows the lost generation of Syrian students. So these displaced students have been unable to pursue higher education. And when they come to host countries, they're missing documents because they had to flee. And so there have been recommendations for alternate evaluation that included, for example, reconstructing their background, corroborating their background, and assessing their competencies, because it's of the utmost importance that they be allowed in for higher education, because when they move back and the country is undergoing reconstruction, their knowledge is really greatly going to help with things. So moving to the next slide. Okay, so thank you to the plenary speaker, Dr. Jim Cummins, for informing me about this Crossroads exhibit that took place at the World Culture Museum in Sweden. And there are the voices of 200 Syrian refugees on their experiences escaping the war. And so they describe going from normalcy to chaos, ending up in detention centers where they were beaten or tortured, broken physically and mentally, and then having to flee and having long journeys with traffickers. And then when they arrived on safe shores, they were possibly met with kindness and compassion, but also sometimes with disgust and hatred. And their testimonials speak to loss, pain, suffering, perseverance, and hope. On the right-hand side, you have the testimonial of Summer, who describes being 50 people crammed together in the cargo space of a truck, lying on top of each other with explosions all around. And on the next slide, the focus of our study is on how pedagogies, policies, and practices meet youth refugees' language and literacy and resettlement needs at the post-secondary level. So phase one of the study looks at what professors and disciplinary coordinators view as youth refugees' language and literacy needs, and also pedagogies, policies, and pedagogical practices. And in this part of the study, it primarily had to do with English language training. So English language degree bridging programs, but also apprenticeships, skilled trades degree programs that supported language and literacy development, resettlement needs, and also socio-emotional needs. For a theoretical framework, we drew on Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, and it has a nested arrangement of concentric structures, each contained within the next, sort of like Russian dolls. And so it's the relationships between the multiple settings. So beginning with the micro, the individual, the family, moving out to classrooms, peer groups, digital social networks. And so there's the sort of the micro, the inner to the outer macro relationship and with the ripple down effect happening from broader social structures and politics, and the ripple down effect to how that influences the individual. So the world events affecting the smaller structures, such as learning activities in the classrooms, or in some cases, stopping learning altogether with social upheaval, and how that affects their personal and social development. In terms of our literature review, we looked at how the numbers of refugee students in Canada certainly warrant targeted response now. So if you look at the table, 7% of all newcomer children aged newborn to age 14 now are youth refugees or children refugees, and that accounts for 1% of Canadian children. 14% of newcomer youths are youth refugees, and that accounts for 2.4% of all Canadian children. And so they need culturally sensitive, context-specific supports. But if they're not identified as a group, if instructors don't know that there are refugees in the classroom, then they won't get the targeted supports that they need. And Canada has been loath to move beyond recognizing immigration variables, but not so much race or refugees, although race has come much more to the fore during the pandemic. So the second focus of the literature is on language and literacy and socio-emotional needs, and educators often expect students to be functionally literate at the post-secondary level. They just assume if they're there, they have to be able to cut it. And they sometimes have difficulty identifying how to address youth refugees' literacy learning needs. And so this calls to a view and measure resilience within a sociological framework that captures variation in individual, relational, and contextual factors. There's a need to extend Glocal mental health supports and recognize the sorts of psychosocial distress that we saw in those stories, mental health difficulties that are a result of these lived experiences of war, lifetime trauma, and displacement. And again, this lack of recognition can lead to a lack of educator preparedness to deal with language literacy, socio-emotional issues. However, supports do exist. There is a very well-developed British Columbia Ministry of Education document called Students from Refugee Backgrounds, a guide for teachers and schools. And it specifically looks at psychological effects of the refugee experience, and it covers topics such as post-traumatic stress disorder, trauma, predictable anxiety triggers, and it even has suggestions for positive experiences and anxiety buffers. But again, the trick is that educators need to know that some of the students in their classrooms are youth refugees. So finally, the third focus of the literature is the need for educational structures. Cummins, in his plenary for Searle last year, has questioned why mechanisms are not in place for ELT specialists to work with disciplinary specialists when students have language and literacy needs in content-based instruction. And so this broader view supports Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. That is how larger structures in youth refugees' lives, world events affect smaller structures, educational structures, and then classroom learning activities, which in turn affect their personal and social development. And now I'll turn it over to Yasmin.
Thank you, Shelley. So I'll be discussing the methodology. So firstly, we conducted our research among 3 post-secondary institutions where we received ethical clearance to do so. So our study is made up of 3 phases. In the first phase, we did an inventory of institutional student services. We surveyed and interviewed with educators as well as key stakeholders. The interviews that we will look at were more in depth. The surveys that we collected were more so just to understand very briefly the situation in those institutions, and then so we will be discussing more of the interview data. And then phase 2, we interviewed and surveyed as well students who identified as refugees at the post-secondary level. And we also invited them to participate in a digital storytelling project where they could select a project of their liking, whether it was a video resume or a blog or a video blog, a vlog, where they could discuss their prior background, any language experiences they've had, and also work with a researcher to cultivate their digital storytelling and creative skills. And lastly, our third phase was to form some form of a digital website or digital showcase, which we are currently in the process of doing. So as I said, these findings that come from phase 1, so the interviews with post-secondary professors, and these professors came from a variety of programs such as degree programs, English bridge programs, continuing education, and apprenticeship programs. So we'll be briefly looking at Sam, Jamie, and Alex's responses. So first off, we have 4 main findings from these surveys and interviews. And so the first finding is the inventory of student services. Are they efficient enough to meet the youth refugees' needs? Number 2 is, who are refugees? How are they found? How are they understood? The third is literacy and language learning. So we investigated that. And the fourth is social and emotional needs. So first, so basically when we looked at the inventory of student services, we found out that refugees don't have access to the international center, and this is very critical. So they don't have access to the immigration advisor, international admissions, international student life coordinators, arrival settlement facilitator, and it's because they have permanent status or refugee status. Instead, they only get access to the same services that a domestic or a Canadian student would have. So they would only be able to access the learning support such as peer tutoring, academic advising, counseling services, and might I add that it's only available to those who are full-time students. And lastly, mentorship programs, so volunteer opportunities and things like that. So through our analysis, we found that there are no services specifically tailored to refugee students, and that basically this is an issue because if we're not able to identify who is a refugee or not, how do we know that they're accessing the correct services and if there are no correct services for them? So here are some quotes from our participants. One professor said, "I think we just haven't seen a need for services. We provide services to everybody and we either don't have enough refugees or they're not coming forward or they don't have the issues that are specific to their refugee status." Another participant said that the services are already sufficient, which we don't necessarily think is maybe sufficient. And then also in contrast to that, another participant, Sam, said that they absolutely need more psychological support for the traumas that they endure, such as the ones that Shelley shared at the beginning of this presentation. So the second finding was, who are they? In our survey and interview data, many of the educators proclaimed that they were unsure who a refugee was, and that the post-secondary institutions don't flag who is a refugee. They don't get like a list at the beginning of the semester to tell them who is who. And it's very hard to distinguish them. The only way to do so is if they self-identify. So, and professors admitted that they were not willing and that it was a privacy issue for them to ask students, which they shouldn't have to say. So another very important and very impactful quote was said by Sam, where Sam said, "We don't really know who they are. And secondly, we have to let them talk. We can't ask them. I mean, we could, but it would be possibly very insensitive and also not necessarily relevant to the material." In most of my courses, so Sam goes on to say that they've had some refugees, but still they're not able to tell who is who. And then another really important quote basically is that a lot of the professors maybe intend to find out the English ability of their students before they find out if they're a refugee or not. This helps them teach the class better to fit the needs of the students, but not necessarily specific to refugees. The third finding is literacy in learning. So professors and programs are based on academic material and language focus. So the use of cultural knowledge or prior experiences are not at the forefront of their information, and we'll see that later on through their quotes. Professors also don't receive targeted professional development sessions for refugees. And so if a refugee has a specific need, they would just access the normal services that everybody else is open to using. So Alex said that these two quotes summarize how refugees or those who struggle mainly struggle with literacy, so writing, spelling, vocabulary, things like that. And Jamie also says that one of the biggest challenges for refugee students is literacy skills. So that's, an agreement right there. Jamie also says that that the readings are not catered to anyone for specific cultural background. They don't accommodate this because sometimes you have, 10 students in your class from different cultural backgrounds. So it's very hard to accommodate this. The readings are often selected. And Sam also says this as well, that the textbooks are, formulated and there's not a lot of leeway to change these. And lastly, Jamie also expressed that they wish that they had some PD sessions to help them understand the refugee students. So I'm going to pass this off to Kate now.
Great, thank you, Yasmin. So I'm going to be talking about what we found out about these students' socio-emotional needs. So teacher attitudes and preparedness to address potentially complex needs. I'll be talking about that a little bit. Also, lack of identification and lack of refugee-specific services, again, comes up when we're talking about providing support for these students' socio-emotional needs. Alex's assertion here that it's just a language classroom full of non-native English speakers from all over the world, and Sam saying, you are just a professor and not a psychologist. So in regards to trauma, these professors expressed that it can be very challenging because they don't really know how they can really help students from a refugee background because they don't have that experience, they don't have that know-how, and so they feel ill-equipped to do so. So students aren't identified as refugees, as we mentioned, and unless they self-identify. So it appears that some professors just don't differentiate, right? So this can lead to instruction being sort of a one-size-fits-all. And again, teachers feel ill-equipped or feel that it's just not their job to address these students' socio-emotional needs or trauma. So these three quotes are meant to illustrate three different experiences and different perceptions of how refugee background students are faring and what their needs might be. So Alex, for example, didn't feel that there were mental health issues with these students, or at least there weren't any that manifested in their classroom. Jamie, on the other hand, felt that yes, there may have been trauma, but thought of it more as something that might have been an issue upon initial arrival into Canada. And so sort of felt that once these students entered their classroom, those issues are less or possibly resolved, and didn't really see any strong emotional needs from her students. And finally, Sam had a very different perception based on their experiences in the classroom, and says, this is from Sam, says, in the past, I've had a few students who struggle with ongoing events at home. I mean that they've had trauma themselves, but also I've had several students who have had friends or family members killed or seriously injured during the class time, which generated a series of very serious problems for them. They have received mail, or they would have received notifications that their family member is now in hospital, or they can't find their family member. This has been a problem for 2 of my students so far. So it is not that they wouldn't be successful, it's that this ongoing trauma, it's just hard for them to succeed. Okay, so This sort of speaks to these variable experiences and perceptions really speak to, the fact that different instructors have different experiences and different relationships with students in their classroom. And also, possibly to a lack of professional development in terms of really understanding and being able to address youth refugees' socio-emotional needs. Okay, so just some discussion on our findings. The primary focus for professors on academics and or language ability and a prescriptive curriculum mean that more inclusive instructional practices that draw from students' existing knowledge and life experiences is often the exception rather than the rule. Again, instructors are not provided with targeted professional development to address the needs of youth refugee students, and generally have expressed that they don't feel equipped to meet the potentially complex needs of these students. Again, identification is an issue. Refugees are usually not identified unless they self-identify. So refugee-specific services are lacking, and institutions are unable to identify if and which services are needed. So in terms of recommendations, admissions, in order to provide access for these students, they need to be identified, right? And in terms of admissions, often they come with missing or incomplete records. So there needs to be policies and practices in place to be able to provide access for these students. Professional development needs to be happening for instructors so that they're better able to address these students' needs. And finally, it's everyone's job. So more effective and inclusive instruction for youth refugees in tertiary education involves incorporating accountability for these students more broadly throughout the educational system and within individual institutions, from administration to teaching staff, motivated by an understanding that everyone is responsible for the success of these students. So just bringing it back to our theoretical framework, Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, if we want to prevent sort of another lost generation of youth refugees, there are things that need to happen at various levels. So first, within the microsystem, that's the schools, that's the immediate environment, right? The schools, the teachers. And although they can't go it alone, schools and teachers have a unique opportunity to provide more inclusive and equitable educational opportunities for refugee youth. Professional development is needed, targeted services are needed, and more scholarships and alternative admissions procedures are needed to provide access to these students. But enduring change will need to involve multiple levels of the education system and government. So this is where we get out into the other systems. Post-secondary institutions are at the MESO system level. They also have a pivotal role to play in helping refugees pursue higher education. They have the ability to bypass bureaucratic inefficiencies. They can prioritize refugee applications and provide facilities and services for students and their families. So these institutions are able to waive certain requirements and allocate social services as needed for the students. At the exosystem level, we're looking at governmental and educational systems and their policies and practices. And those policies and practices have a pivotal role to play as well. And in regards to collecting that socio-demographic data needed to get a full picture of how youth refugees are faring and what services are needed to better support them. As Robson 2018 says, a lack of data does not mean lack of a problem. By not collecting data on race and other important socio-demographic factors of students, we fail to correct systemic barriers to success in our educational system. By conflating immigrant success with a blanket commitment to equality, we blindly assume we are doing okay, as we do not have any evidence to the contrary, because we haven't taken the time to collect it. So I'll just leave on a note from Magaziner 2015. In order to prevent another lost generation of youth refugees in education, post-secondary education should be viewed not as a luxury, but as an investment in the future.
I just wanted to mention that this is a SSHRC-funded study, and the principal investigator is Maureen Kendrick at UBC. And there are actually 3 sites. So in the UBC site, it's Maureen Kendrick and Margaret Early. There's also a Toronto-based research study headed by Saskia Van Vegan, and then also this Western study. So I wanted to mention that as well. Thank you so much to Kate and Yasmin, and thank you very much for listening.